One a fellow traveler, I believe that a well-known anecdote exists to the effect that a young writer, determined to make the commencement of his story forcible and original enough to catch and rivet the attention of the most blasé of editors, penned the following sentence: "Hell," said the Duchess. Strangely enough, this tale of mine opens in much the same fashion, only the lady who gave utterance to the exclamation was not a duchess. It was a day in early June. I had been transacting some business in Paris and was returning by the morning service to London, where I was still sharing rooms with my old friend, the Belgian ex-detective, Hercule Poirot. The Calais express was singularly empty. In fact, my own conveyance held only one other traveler. I had made a somewhat hurried departure from the hotel and was busy assuring myself that I had duly collected all my traps, when the train started. Up till then I had hardly noticed my companion, but I was now violently recalled to the fact of her existence. Jumping up from her seat, she let down the window and stuck her head out, withdrawing it a moment later with the brief and forcible ejaculation, "Hell, now I am old-fashioned. A woman, I consider, should be womanly. I have no patience with the modern neurotic girl who jazzes from morning to night, smokes like a chimney, and uses language which would make a Billingsgate fishwoman blush." I looked up, frowning slightly, into a pretty, impudent face, surmounted by a rakish little red hat. A thick cluster of black curls hid each ear. I judged that she was little more than 17, but her face was covered with powder, and her lips were quite impossibly scarlet. Nothing abashed, she returned my glance, and executed an expressive grimace. "Dear me, we've shocked the kind gentleman," she observed to an imaginary audience. "I apologize for my language. Most unladylike, and all that, but, oh, Lord, there's reason in for it. Do you know I've lost my only sister?" "Really?" I said politely. "How unfortunate." "He disapproves," remarked the lady. "He disapproves utterly of me, and my sister, which last is unfair, because he hasn't seen her." I opened my mouth, but she forestalled me. "Say no more. Nobody loves me. I shall go into the garden and eat worms. Boo-hoo. I am crushed." She buried herself behind a large comic French. In a minute or two I saw her eyes stealthily peeping at me over the top. In spite of myself I could not help smiling, and in a minute she had tossed the paper aside, and had burst into a merry peal of laughter. "I am you weren't such a mutt as you looked," she cried. Her laughter was so infectious that I could not help joining in, though I hardly cared for the word mutt. "There. Now we're friends," declared the minx. "Say you're sorry about my sister." "I am desolate." "That's a good boy. Let me finish. I was going to add that, although I am desolate, I can manage to put up with her absence very well." I made a little bow. But this most unaccountable of damsels frowned and shook her head. "Cut it out. I prefer the dignified disapproval stunt." "Oh, your face. Not one of us," it said. "And you were at LT there though, mind you, it's pretty hard to tell nowadays. It's not everyone who can distinguish between a demi and a duchess. There now, I believe I've shocked you again. You've been dug out of the backwoods, you have. Not that I mind that. We could do with a few more of your sort. I just hate a fellow who gets fresh, it makes me." She shook her head vigorously. "What are you like when you're mad?" I inquired with a smile. "A regular little devil. Don't care what I say, or what I do, either. I nearly did a chap in once. Yes, really. He'd have deserved it too. Well, I begged, don't get mad with me." "I shan't. I like you did the first moment I set eyes on you, but you looked so disapproving that I never thought we should make friends." "Well, we have. Tell me something about yourself." "I'm an actress." "No, not the kind you're fluenking of. I've been on the boards since I was a HD of 6 tumbling." "I beg your pardon," I said, puzzled. "Haven't you ever seen child acrobats?" "Oh, I understand. I'm American born, but I've spent most of me life in England. We've got a new show, my sister and I, sort of song and dance, and a bit of patter, and a dash of the old business thrown in. It's quite a new idea, and it hits them every time. There's going to be money in it. My new acquaintance leaned forward, and discoursed volubly, a great many of her terms being quite unintelligible to me. Yet I found myself evincing an increasing interest in her. She seemed such a curious mixture of child and woman, though perfectly worldly wise, and able, as she expressed it, to take care of herself. There was yet something curiously ingenuous in her single-minded attitude towards life, and her wholehearted determination to make good. We passed Amiens. The name awakened many memories. My companion seemed to have an intuitive knowledge of what was in my mind. Thinking of the war? I nodded. You were it, I suppose. Pretty well. I was wounded once, and after the Somme they invalided me out altogether. I'm a sort of private secretary now to an NIP. My. That's brainy. No, it isn't. There's really awfully little to do. Usually a couple of hours every day sees me. It's dull work too. In fact, I don't know what I should do if I hadn't got something to fall back upon. Don't say you collect bugs. No, I share rooms with a very interesting man. He's a Belgian, an ex-detective. He's set up as a private detective in London, and he's doing extraordinarily well. He's really a very marvelous little man. Time and again he has proved to be right where the official police have failed. My companion listened with widening eyes. Isn't that interesting now? I just adore crime. I go to all the mysteries on the movies. And when there's a murder on, I just devour the papers. Do you remember the Styles case? I asked. Let me see, was that the old lady who was poisoned? Somewhere down in Essex. I nodded. That was Poirot's first big case. Undoubtedly, but for him the murderer would have escaped scot-free. It was a most wonderful bit of detective work. Warming to my subject, I ran over the heads of the affair, working up to the triumphant and unexpected denouement. The girl listened spellbound. In MCT, we were so absorbed that the train drew into Calais station before we realized it. I secured a couple of porters, and we alighted on the platform. My companion held out her hand. Goodbye, and I'll mind my language better in future. Oh, but surely you'll let me look after you on the boat. Mayn't be on the boat? I've got to see whether that sister of mine got aboard after all anywhere. But thanks, all the same. Oh, but we're going to meet again, surely? Aren't you even going to tell me your name? I cried, as she turned away. She looked over her shoulder. Cinderella, she said, and laughed. But little did I think when and how I should see Cinderella again. To an appeal for help. It was 9:05 when I entered our joint sitting room for breakfast on the following morning. My friend Poirot, exact to the minute as usual, was just tapping the shell of his second EAE. He beamed upon me as I entered. You have slept well, yes? You have recovered from the crossing so terrible? It is a marvel, almost you are exact this morning. Pardon, but your tie is not symmetrical. Permit that I rearrange him. Elsewhere, I have described Hercule Poirot. An extraordinary little man. Height, 5 feet 4 inches, egg-shaped head carried a little to one side, eyes that shone green when he was excited, stiff military mustache, air of dignity immense. He was neat and dandified in appearance. For neatness of any kind he had an absolute passion. To see an ornament set crookedly, or a speck of dust, or a slight disarray in one's attire, was torture to the little man until he could ease his feelings by remedying the matter. Order and method were his gods. He had a certain disdain for tangible evidence, such as footprints and cigarette ash, and would maintain that, taken by themselves, they would never enable a detective to solve a problem. Then he would tap his egg-shaped head with absurd complacency, and remark with great satisfaction, "The true work, it is done from within. The little grey cells, remember always the little grey cells, mon ami." I slipped into my seat, and remarked idly, in answer to Poirot's greeting, that an hour's sea passage from Calais to Dover could hardly be dignified by the epithet terrible. Anything interesting come by the post? I asked. Poirot shook his head with a dissatisfied air. I have not yet examined my letters, but nothing of interest arrives nowadays. The great criminals, the criminals of method, They do not exist. He shook his head despondently, and I roared with laughter. Cheer up, Poirot, the luck will change. Open your letters. For all you know, there may be a great case looming on the horizon. Poirot smiled, and taking up the neat little letter opener with which he opened his correspondence, he slit the tops of the several envelopes that lay by his plate. A bill. Another bill. It is that I grow extravagant in my old age. Aha! A note from Jep. Yes. I pricked up my ears. The Scotland Yard inspector had more than once introduced us to an interesting case. He merely thanks me, in his fashion, for a little point in the Aberystwyth case on which I was able to set him right. I am delighted to have been of service to him. Poirot continued to read his correspondence placidly. A suggestion that I should give a lecture to our local Boy Scouts. The Countess of Forfinoak will be obliged if I will call and see her. Another lapdog without doubt. And now for the last. I looked up, quick to notice the change of tone. Poirot was reading attentively. In a minute he tossed the sheet over to me. This is out of the ordinary, mon amount, read for yourself. The letter was written on a foreign type of paper, in a bold characteristic hand, Villa Genevieve, Merlinville-sur-Mer, France. Dear Sir, I am in need of the services of a detective and, for reasons which I will give you later, do not wish to call in the official police. I have heard of you from several quarters, and all reports go to show that you are not only a man of decided ability, but one who also knows how to be discreet. I do not wish to trust details to the post, but, on account of a secret I possess, I go in daily fear of my life. I am convinced that the danger is imminent, and therefore I beg that you will lose no time in crossing to France. I will send a car to meet you at Calais, if you will wire me when you are arriving. I shall be obliged if you will drop all cases you have on hand, and devote yourself solely to no interests. I am prepared to pay any compensation necessary. I shall probably need your services for a considerable period of time, as it may be necessary for you to go out to Santiago, where I spent several years of my life. I shall be content for you to name your own fee. Assuring you once more that the matter is urgent. Yours faithfully, P.T. Renauld. Below the signature was a hastily scrawled line, almost illegible, "For God's sake, come." I handed the letter back with quickened pulses. At last, I said. Here is something distinctly out of the ordinary. Yes, indeed, said Poirot meditatively. You will go, of course, I continued. Poirot nodded. He was thinking deeply. Finally he seemed to make up his mind, and glanced up at the clock. His face was very grave. See you, my friend, there is no time to lose. The Continental Express leaves Victoria at 11:00. Do not agitate yourself. There is plenty of time. We can allow 10 minutes for discussion. You accompany me, N.S.C.E.P.A. Well, you told me yourself that your employer needed you not for the next few weeks. Oh, that's all right. But this near. Renauld hints strongly that his business is private. Ta. I will manage M. Renauld. By the way, I seem to know the name. There's a well-known South American millionaire fellow. His name's Renauld. I don't know whether it could be the same. But without doubt. That explains the mention of Santiago. Santiago is in Chile, and Chile it is in South America. Ah, but we progress finely. You remarked the postscript. How did it strike you? I considered. Clearly he wrote the letter keeping himself well in hand, but at the end his self-control snapped and, on the impulse of the moment, he scrawled those 4 desperate words. But my friend shook his head energetically. You are in error. See you not that while the ink of the signature is nearly black, that of the postscript is quite pale? Well, I said, puzzled. Mon Dieu, mon ami, but use your little grey cells. Is it not obvious? N.F.R. Renauld wrote his letter. Without blotting it, he reread it carefully. Then, not on impulse, but deliberately, he added those last words, and blotted the sheet. But why? Parbleu! so that it should produce the effect upon me that it has upon you, mais we to make sure of my coming. He reread the letter and was dissatisfied. It was not strong enough at all. He paused, and then added softly, his eyes shining with that green light that always betokenned inward excitement, and so, mon ami, since that postscript was added, not on impulse, but soberly, in cold blood, the urgency is very great, and we must reach him as soon as possible. Merlinville, I murmured. Thou and Lly. I've heard of it, I think. Poirot nodded. It is a quiet little place but chic. It lies about midway between Boulogne and Calais. Mr. Renaud has a house in England, yes, in Rutland Gate, as far as I remember. Also a big place in the country somewhere in Hertfordshire. But I really know very little about him. He doesn't do much in a social way. I believe he has large South American interests in the city, and has spent most of his life out in Chile and the Argentine. Well, we shall hear all the details from the man himself. Come, let us pack. A small suitcase each, and then a taxi to Victoria. 11 o'clock saw our departure from Victoria on our way to Dover. Before starting, Poirot had dispatched a telegram to Agatha Renaud giving the time of our arrival at Calais. I'm surprised you haven't invested in a few bottles of some seasick remedy, Poirot, I observed maliciously, as I recalled our conversation at breakfast. My friend, who was ominously scanning the weather, turned a reproachful face upon me. Is it that you have forgotten the method most excellent of Le Verguier? His système I practice it always. One balances oneself, if you remember, turning the head from left to right, breathing in and out, counting 6 between each breath. I demurred. You'll be rather tired of balancing yourself and counting 6 by the time you get to Santiago, or Buenos Aires, or wherever it is you land. Quelle idée! You do not figure to yourself that I shall go to Santiago. Mr. Renaud suggests it in his letter. He did not emo the methods of Hercule Poirot. I do not run to and fro, making journeys, and agitating myself. My work is done from within. Here he tapped his forehead significantly. As usual, this remark roused my argumentative faculty. It's all very well, Poirot, but I think you are falling into the habit of despising certain things too much. A fingerprint has led sometimes to the arrest and conviction of a murderer. And has, without doubt, hanged more than one innocent man, remarked Poirot dryly. But surely the study of fingerprints and footprints, cigarette ash, different kinds of mud, and other clues that comprise the minute observation of details, all these are of vital importance. But certainly, I have never said otherwise. The trained observer, the expert, without doubt he is useful. But the others, the Hercules Poirots, they are above the experts. To them the experts bring the facts, their business is the method of the crime, its logical deduction, the proper sequence and order of the facts, above all, the true psychology of the case. You have hunted the fox, yes. I have hunted a bit, now and again, I said, rather bewildered by this abrupt change of subject. Why? Eh bien, this hunting of the fox, you need the dogs, no. Hounds, I corrected gently. Yes, of course. But yet, Poirot wagged his finger at me. You did not descend from your horse and run along the ground smelling with your nose and uttering loud ows. In spite of myself I laughed immoderately. Poirot nodded in a satisfied manner. So, you leave the work of the hounds to the hounds. Yet you demand that I, Hercule Poirot, should make myself ridiculous by lying down, possibly on damp grass, to study hypothetical footprints, and should scoop up cigarette ash when I do not know one HND from the other. Remember the Plymouth Express mystery. The good Jap departed to make a survey of the railway line. When he returned, I, without having moved from my apartments, was able to tell him exactly what he had found. So you are of the opinion that Jap wasted his time? Not at all, since his evidence confirmed my theory. But I should have wasted my time if I had gone. It is the same with so-called remember the handwriting testimony in the Cavendish case. One counsel's questioning brings out testimony as to the resemblances, the defense brings evidence to show dissimilarity. All the language is very technical. And the result? What we all knew in the first place. The writing was very like that of John Cavendish. And the psychological mind is faced with the question, am I? Because it was actually his? Or because someone wished us to think it was his? I answered that question, mon ami, and answered it correctly. And Poirot, having effectually silenced, if not convinced me, leaned back with a satisfied air. On the boat, I knew better than to disturb my friend's solitude. The weather was gorgeous, and the sea as smooth as the proverbial mill pond, so I was hardly surprised when a smiling Poirot joined me on disembarking at Calais. A disappointment was in store for us, as no car had been sent to meet us, but Poirot put this down to his telegram having been delayed in transit. "We will hire a car," he said cheerily. And a few minutes later saw us creaking and jolting along, in the most ramshackle of automobiles that ever plied for hire, in the direction of Merlinville. My spirits were at their highest, but my little friend was observing me gravely. "You are what the Scotch people call fey, Hastings. It presages disaster." "Nonsense. At any rate, you do not share my feelings." "No, but I am afraid." "Afraid of what?" "I do not know. But I have a premonition a je ne sais quoi." He spoke so gravely that I was impressed in spite of myself. "I have a feeling," he said slowly, "that this is going to be a big affair, a long, troublesome problem that will not be easy to work out." I would have questioned him further, but we were just coming into the little town of Merlinville, and we slowed up to inquire the way to the Villa Genevieve. "Straight on, monsieur, the town. The Villa Genevieve is about half a mile the other side. You cannot miss it. A big villa, overlooking the sea." We thanked our informant, and drove on, leaving the town behind. A fork in the road brought us to a second halt. A peasant was trudging towards us, and we waited for him to come up to us in order to ask the way again. There was a tiny villa standing right by the road, but it was too small and dilapidated to be the one we wanted. As we waited, the gate of it swung open and a girl came out. The peasant was passing us now, and the driver leaned forward from his seat and asked for direction. "The Villa Genevieve? Just a few steps up this road to the right, monsieur. You could see it if it were not for the curve." The chauffeur thanked him, and started the car again. My eyes were fascinated by the girl who still stood, with one hand on the gate, watching us. I am an admirer of beauty, and here was one whom nobody could have passed without remark, very tall, with the proportions of a young goddess, her uncovered golden head gleaming in the sunlight. I swore to myself that she was one of the most beautiful girls I had ever seen. As we swung up the Royal Road, I turned my head to look after her. "By Jove, Poirot," I exclaimed, "did you see that young goddess?" Poirot raised his eyebrows. "Ça commence," he murmured. "Already you have seen a goddess. But, hang it all, wasn't she?" "Possibly, I did not remark the fact." "Surely you noticed her?" "Mon ami, two people rarely see the same fluing. You, for instance, saw a goddess." He hesitated. "Yes. I saw only a girl with amias eyes," said Poirot gravely. But at that moment we drew up at a big green gate, and, simultaneously, we both uttered an exclamation. Before it stood an imposing Sergeant de Ville. He held up his hand to bar our way. "You cannot pass, messieurs." "But we wish to see near." "Renaud," I cried. "We have an appointment." "This is his villa, isn't it?" "Yes, monsieur," but Poirot leaned forward. "But what?" "Monsieur Renaud was murdered this morning." 3 at the Villa Genevieve. In a moment Poirot had leapt from the car, his eyes blazing with excitement. "What is that you say? Murdered? Hen? How?" The Sergeant de Ville drew himself up. "I cannot answer any questions, monsieur. True. I comprehend." Poirot reflected for a minute. "The commissary of police, he is without doubt within." "Yes, monsieur." Poirot took out a card, and scribbled a few words on it. "Voila. Will you have the goodness to see that this card is sent into the commissary at once?" The man took it and, turning his head over his shoulder, whistled. In a few seconds a cornraid joined him, and was handed Poirot's message. There was a wait of some minutes, and then a short, stout man with a huge moustache came bustling down to the gate. The Sergeant de Ville saluted and stood aside. "My dear Monsieur Poirot," cried the newcomer, "I am delighted to see you. Your arrival is most opportune." Poirot's face had lighted up. "Monsieur Bex. This is indeed a pleasure." He turned to me. "This is an English friend of mine, Captain Hastings, Monsieur Lucien Bex." The Cornmissary and I bowed to each other ceremoniously, and M. Bex tuned once more to Poirot. "Mon vieux, I have not seen you since 1909, that time in Ostend. You have information to give which may assist us. Possibly you know it already. You were aware that I had been sent for?" "No." "By whom?" "The dead man. It seems that he knew an attempt was going to be made on his life. Unfortunately he sent for me too late." "Sacre tonnerre," ejaculated the Frenchman. "So he foresaw his own murder. That upsets our theories considerably. But come inside." He held the gate open, and we commenced walking towards the house. M. Bex continued to talk. "The ex-arme magistrate, Monsieur Hotet, must hear of this at once. He has just finished examining the scene of the crime and is about to begin his interrogations." "When was the crime committed?" asked Poirot. "The body was discovered this morning about 9 o'clock. Madame Renaud's evidence and that of the doctors goes to show that death must have occurred about 2 a.m. But enter, I pray of you." We had arrived at the steps which led up to the front door of the villa. In the hall another Sergeant de Ville was sitting. He rose at sight of the commissary. "Where is Monsieur Hotet now?" inquired the latter. "In the salon, monsieur." M. Bex opened a door to the left of the hall, and we passed in. M. Hotet and his clerk were sitting at a big round table. They looked up as we entered. The commissary introduced us, and explained our presence. M. Hotet, the Duc d'Instruction, was a tall gaunt man, with piercing dark eyes, and a neatly cut grey beard, which he had a habit of caressing as he talked. Standing by the mantelpiece was an elderly man, with slightly stooping shoulders, who was introduced to us as Dr. Durand. "Most extraordinary," remarked M. Hotet as the commissary finished speaking. "You have the letter here, monsieur." Poirot handed it to him, and the magistrate read it. He speaks of a secret. What a pity he was not more explicit. "We are much indebted to you, Monsieur Poirot. I hope you will do us the honor of assisting us in our investigations. Or are you obliged to return to London?" "Monsieur le Juge, I propose to remain. I did not arrive in time to prevent my client's death, but I feel myself bound in honor to discover the assassin." The magistrate bowed. "These sentiments do you honor. Also, without doubt, Madame Renaud will wish to retain your services. We are expecting M. Giroux from the Surete in Paris any moment, and I am sure that you and he will be able to give each other mutual assistance in your investigations. In the meantime, I hope that you will do me the honor to be present at my interrogations, and I need hardly say that if there is any assistance you require it is at your disposal. I thank you, monsieur. You will comprehend that at present I am conveniently in the dark. I am nothing whatever." M. Hotet nodded to the commissary, and the latter took up the tale. "This morning, the old servant Frangoise, on descending to start her work, found the front door ajar. Feeling a momentary alarm as to burglars, she looked into the dining room, but seeing the silver was safe she thought no more about it, concluding that her master had, without doubt, risen early, and gone for a stroll." "Pardon, monsieur, for interrupting, but was that a common practice of his?" "No, it was not, but old Frangoise has the common idea as regards the English that they are mad, and liable to do the most unaccountable things at any moment. Going to call her mistress as usual, a young maid, Leonie, was horrified to discover her gagged and bound, and almost at the same moment news was brought that Monsieur Renaud's body had been discovered, stone dead, stabbed in the back where. That is one of the most extraordinary features of the case. Monsieur Poirot, the body was lying face downwards, in an open grave." "Yes. The pit was freshly dug just a few yards outside the boundary of the villa grounds. And it had been dead how long? Dr. Durand answered this. I examined the body this morning at 10 o'clock. Death must have taken place at least 7, and possibly 10 hours previously. That fixes it at between midnight and 3 a.m. exactly, and Nears. Reinald's evidence places it at after 2 a.m., which narrows the field still farther. Death must have been instantaneous, and naturally could not have been self-inflicted. Poirot nodded, and the commissary resumed. Madame Reinald was hastily freed from the cords that bound her by the horrified servants. She was in a terrible condition of weakness, almost unconscious from the pain of her bonds. It appears that 2 masked men entered the aerodrome, gagged and bound her, while forcibly abducting her husband. This we know at second hand from the servants. On hearing the tragic news, she fell at once into an alarming state of agitation on arrival. Dr. Urand immediately prescribed a sedative, and we have not yet been able to question her. But without doubt she will awake more calm, and be equal to bearing the strain of the interrogation. The commissary paused. And the inmates of the house, monsieur? There is old Frangoisse, the housekeeper. She lived for many years with the former owners of the Villa Genevieve. Then there are 2 young girls, sisters, Denise and Leonie Allard. Their home is in Merlinville, and they come off most respectable parents. Then there is the chauffeur whom Monsieur Reinald brought over from England with Hira, but he is away on a holiday. Finally there are Madame Reinald and her son, Monsieur Jacques Reinald. He, too, is away from home at present. Poirot bowed his head. Mhotet spoke en Larcod. The sergeant de ville appeared. Bring in the woman Frangoisse. The man saluted, and disappeared. In a moment or two he returned, escorting the frightened Frangoisse. Your name is Frangoisse Richet? Yes, monsieur. You have been a long time in service at the Villa Genevieve. 11 years with Madame la Vicomtesse. Then when she sold the villa this spring, I consented to remain on with the English milor. Never did I imagine the magistrate cut her short. Without doubt, without doubt. Now, Frangoisse, in this matter of the front door, whose business was it to fasten it at N at LT? Mine, monsieur. Always I saw to it myself. And last I fastened it as usual. You are sure of that? I swear it by the blessed saints, monsieur. What time would that be? The same time as usual, 10:30, monsieur. What about the rest of the household? Had they gone up to bed? Madame had retired some time before. Denise and Leonie went up with me. Monsieur was still in his study. Then, if anyone unfastened the door afterwards, it must have been Monsieur Reinald himself. Frangoisse shrugged her broad shoulders. What should he do that for? With robbers and assassins passing every minute. A nice idea. Monsieur was not an imbecile. It is not as though he had had to let the lady out. The magistrate interrupted sharply. The lady? What lady do you mean? Why, the lady who came to see him. Had a lady been to see him that evening? But yes, monsieur, and many other evenings as well. Who was she? Did you know her? A rather cunning look spread over the woman's face. How should I know who it was? She grumbled. I did not let her in last night. Aha, roared the exam_LNG magistrate, bringing his hand down with a bang on the table. You would trifle with the police, would you? I demand that you tell me at once the name of this woman who came to visit Monsieur Reinald in the evenings. The police, grumbled Frangoisse. Never did I think that I should be mixed up with the police. But I know well enough who she was. It was Madame d'Aubruil. The commissary uttered an exclamation, and leaned forward as though in utter astonishment. Madame d'Aubruil from the Villa Marguerite just down the road. That is what I said, monsieur. Oh, she is a pretty one. The old woman tossed her head scornfully. Madame d'Aubruil, murmured the commissary. Impossible. Voila, grumbled Frangoisse. That is all you get for telling the truth. Not at all, said the exam_LNG magistrate soothingly. We were surprised, that is all. Madame de Breuil then, and Monsieur Renaud, they were. He paused delicately. Eh? It was that without doubt. How should I know? But what will you? Monsieur, he was Milord Anglat's très riche and Madame de Breuil, she was poor, that one and très chic, for all that she lives so quietly with her daughter. Not a doubt of it, she has had her history. She is no longer young, but ma foi. I who speak to you have seen the men's heads turn after her as she goes down the street. Besides lately, she had had more money to spend, all the town knows it. The little economies, they are at an end. And Frangoise shook her head with an air of unalterable certainty. Amhotet stroked his beard reflectively. And en Madame Renaud, he asked at length. How did she take this friendship? Frangoise shrugged her shoulders. She was always most amiable, most polite. One would say that she suspected nothing. But all the same, is it not so, the heart suffers, monsieur. Day by day, I have watched Madame grow paler and thinner. She was not the same woman who arrived here a month ago. Monsieur, too, has changed. He also has had his worries. One could see that he was on the brink of a crisis of the nerves. And who could wonder, with an affair conducted in such a fashion? No reticence, no discretion. Style Anglais, without doubt. I bounded indignantly in my seat, but the examining magistrate was continuing his questions, undistracted by side issues. You say that Monsieur Renaud had not to let Madame de Breuil out? Had she left, then? Yes, monsieur. I heard them come out of the study and go to the door. Monsieur said good night lt, and shut the door after her. What time was that? About 25 minutes after 10, Monsieur Dot. Do you know when Monsieur Renaud went to bed? I heard him come up about 10 minutes after we did. The stair creaks so that one hears everyone who goes up and down. And that is all? You heard no sound of disturbance during the night? Nothing whatever, monsieur. Which of the servants came down the first in the morning? I did, monsieur. At once I saw the door swinging open. What about the other downstairs windows, were they all fastened? Every one of them. There was nothing suspicious or out of place anywhere. Good. Frangoise, you can go. The old woman shuffled towards the door. On the threshold she looked back. I will tell you one thing, monsieur. That Madame de Breuil, she is a bad one. Oh, yes, one woman knows about another. She is a bad one, remember that. And, shaking her head sagely, Frangoise left the room. Leonie Allard, called the magistrate. Leonie appeared dissolved in tears, and inclined to be hysterical. Amhotet dealt with her adroitly. Her evidence was mainly concerned with the discovery of her mistress gagged and bound, of which she gave rather an exaggerated account. She, like Frangoise, had heard nothing during the night. Her sister, Denise, succeeded her. She agreed that her master had changed greatly of late. Every day he became more and more morose. He ate less. He was always depressed. But Denise had her own theory. Without doubt it was the mafia he had on his track. Two masked men, who else could it be? A terrible society that. It is, of course, possible, said the magistrate smoothly. Now, my girl, was it you who admitted Madame de Breuil to the house last night? Not last night, monsieur, the night before. But Frangoise has just told us that Madame de Breuil was here last night. No, monsieur. A lady did come to see Monsieur Renaud last night, but it was not Madame de Breuil. Surprised, the magistrate insisted, but the girl held firm she knew Madame de Breuil perfectly by st. This lady was dark also, but shorter, and much younger. Nothing could shake her statement. Had you ever seen this lady before? Never, monsieur. And then the girl added diffidently, but I think she was English. Yes, monsieur. She asked for Monsieur Renaud in quite good, but the accent, however slight, one can always tell it. Besides, when they came out of the study they were speaking in English. Did you hear what they said? Could you understand it, I mean? Me, I speak the English very well, said Denise with pride. The lady was speaking too fast for me to catch what she said, but I heard Monsieur's last words as he opened the door for her. She paused, and then repeated carefully and laboriously, "Yes, yes, but for God's sake go now." "Yes, yes, but for God's sake go now," repeated the Magi's freight. He dismissed Denise and, after a moment or two for consideration, recalled Frangoise. To her he propounded the question as to whether she had not made a mistake in fixing the night of Madame d'Aubruil's visit. Frangoise, however, proved unexpectedly obstinate. It was last night that Madame d'Aubruil had come. Without doubt it was she. Denise wished to make herself interesting, voilà tout. So she had cooked up this fine tale about a strange lady. Airing her homage of English, too. Probably Monsieur had never spoken that sentence in English at all, and, even if he had, it proved nothing, for Madame d'Aubruil spoke English perfectly, and generally used that language when talking to Monsieur and Madame Renaud. You see, Monsieur Jacques, the son of Monsieur, was usually here, and he spoke the French very badly. The magistrate did not insist. Instead, he inquired about the chauffeur, and learned that only yesterday Monsieur Renaud had declared that he was not likely to use the car, and that masters might just as well take a holiday. A perplexed frown was beginning to gather between Poirot's eyes. "What is it?" I whispered. He shook his head impatiently, and asked a question. "Pardon, Monsieur Bex, but without doubt Monsieur Renaud could drive the car himself." The corn-misserie looked over at Frangoise, and the old woman replied promptly, "No, Monsieur did not drive himself." Poirot's frown deepened. "I wish you would tell me what is worrying you," I said impatiently. "See you not? In his letter Monsieur Renaud speaks of sending the car for me to Calais." "Perhaps he meant a hired car," I suggested. "Doubtless, that is so. But why hire a car when you have one of your own? Why choose yesterday to send away the chauffeur on a holiday suddenly, at a moment's notice? Was it that for some reason he wanted him out of the way before we arrived?" For the letter signed Bella Frangoise had left the room. The magistrate was drumming thought-all on the table. "Monsieur Bex," he said at length, "here we have directly conflicting testimony. Which are we to believe, Frangoise or Denise?" "Denise," said the commissary decidedly. "It was she who let the visitor. Frangoise is old and obstinate, and has evidently taken a dislike to Madame d'Aubruil. Besides, our own knowledge tends to show that Renaud was entangled with another woman." "Tiens," cried Amhotet. "We have forgotten to inform Monsieur Poirot of that." He searched among the papers on the table, and finally handed the one he was in search of to my friend. "This letter, Monsieur Poirot, we found in the pocket of the dead man's overcoat." Poirot took it and unfolded it. It was somewhat worn and crumpled, and was written in English in a rather unformed hand. "Evo. Dearest one, why have you not written for so long? You do love me still, don't you? Your letters lately have been so different, cold, and strange, and now this long silence. It makes me afraid. If you were to stop loving me. But that's impossible. What a silly kid I am, always imagining things. But if you did stop loving me, I don't know what I should do. Kill myself perhaps. I couldn't live without you. Sometimes I fancy another woman is coming between us. Let her look out, that's all, and you too. I'd as soon kill you as let her have you. I mean, but there, I'm writing high-flown nonsense. You love me, and I love you. Yes, love you, love you, love you. Your own adoring Bella." There was no address or date. Poirot handed it back with a grave face. "And the assumption is?" The examining magistrate shrugged his shoulders. "Obviously Monsieur Renaud was entangled with this Englishwoman Bella. He comes over here, meets Madame d'Aubruil, and starts an intrigue with her. He cools off to the other, and she instantly suspects something. This letter contains a distinct threat. Monsieur Poirot, at first sight the case seemed simplicity itself. Jealousy. The fact that Monsieur Renaud was stabbed in the back seemed to point distinctly to its being a woman's crime." Poirot nodded. "The stab in the back, yes, but not the grave. That was laborious work, hard workwoman dug that grave, monsieur. That was a man's doing. The corn missouri exclaimed excitedly, yes, yes, you are at LT. We did not fluink of that, no, as I said, continued Mhotet. At first sight the case seemed simple, but the masked men, and the letter you received from Monsieur Renaud, convolute matters. Here we seem to have an entirely different set of circumstances, with no relationship between the two. As regards the letter you written to yourself, do you think it is possible that it referred in any way to this Bella and her frets? Poirot shook his head. Hardly. A man like Monsieur Renaud, who had led an adventurous life in out-of-the-way places, would not be likely to ask for protection against a woman. The examining magistrate nodded his head emphatically. My view exactly. Then we must look for the explanation of the letter in Santiago, finished the commissary. I shall cable without delay to the police in that city, requesting full details of the murdered man's life out there, his love affairs, his business transactions, his friendships, and any enmities he may have incurred. It will be strange if, after that, we do not hold a clue to his mysterious murder. The corn missouri looked around for approval. Excellent, said Poirot appreciatively. You have found no other letters from this Bella among Monsieur Renaud's effects? Asked Poirot. No. Of course one of our first proceedings was to search Tifruf his private papers in the study. We found nothing of interest, however. All seemed square and above board. The only thing at all out of the ordinary was his will. Here it is. Poirot ran the document. So. A legacy of £1,000 to Mr. Stoner. Who is he, by the way? Monsieur Renaud's secretary. He remained in England, but was over here once or twice for a weekend. And everything else left unconditionally to his beloved wife, Héloïse. Simply drawn up, but perfectly legal. Witnessed by the two servants, Denise and Frangoise. Nothing so very unusual about that. He handed it back. Perhaps, began Bex, you did not notice the date, twinkled Poirot. But, yes, I noticed it. A fortnight ago. Possibly it marks his first intimation of danger. En Lanny rich men die inte state Tifruf, never considering the likelihood of their demise. But it is dangerous to draw conclusions prematurely. It points, however, to his having a real liking and fondness for his wife, in spite of his amorous intrigues. Yes, said Mhotet doubtfully. But it is possibly a little unfair on his son, since it leaves him entirely dependent on his mother. If she were to marry again, and her second husband obtained an ascendancy over her, this boy might never touch a penny of his father's money. Poirot shrugged his shoulders. Enlin is a vain animal. Monsieur Renaud figured to himself, without doubt, that his widow would never marry again. As to the son, it may have been a wise precaution to leave the money in his mother's hands. The sons of rich men are proverbially wild. It may be as you say. Now, Monsieur Poirot, you would without doubt like to visit the scene of the crime. I am sorry that the body has been removed, but of course photographs have been taken from every conceivable angle, and will be at your disposal as soon as they are available. I thank you, monsieur, for all your courtesy. The corn missouri rose. Come with me, messieurs. He opened the door, and bowed ceremoniously to Poirot to precede him. Poirot, with equal politeness, drew back and bowed to the commissary. Monsieur. Monsieur. At last they got out into the hall. That room there, it is the study, Hein? Asked Poirot suddenly, nodding towards the door opposite. Yes. You would like to see it. He opened the door as he spoke, and we entered. The room which M. Renaud had chosen for his own particular use was small, but furnished with great taste and comfort. A businesslike writing desk, with many pigeonholes, stood in the window. Two large leather-covered armchairs faced the fireplace, and between them was a round table covered with the latest books and magazines. Poirot stood a moment taking in the room, then he stepped forward, passed his hand immediately over the backs of the leather chairs, picked up a magazine from the table, and drew a finger gingerly over the surface of the oak sideboard. His face expressed complete approval. No dust. I asked, with a smile. He beamed on me, appreciative of me knowledge of his peculiarities. Not a particle, mon ami. And for once, perhaps, it is a pity. His sharp, bird-like eyes darted here and there. Ah, he remarked suddenly, with an intonation of relief. The hearthrug is crooked, and he bent down to straighten it. Suddenly he uttered an exclamation and rose. In his hand he held a small fragment of pink paper. In France, as in England, he remarked, the domestics omit to sweep under the mats. Bex took the fragment from him, and I came close to examine it. You recognize it, Hastings? I shook my head, puzzled, and yet that particular shade of pink paper was very familiar. The corn misery's mental processes were quicker than mine. A fragment of a check, he exclaimed. The piece of paper was about 2 inches square. On it was written in ink the word Divine. Bienf, said Bex. This check was payable to, or drawn by, someone named Divine. The former, I fancy, said Poirot. For, if I am not mistaken, the handwriting is that of Monsieur Renaud. That was soon established, by comparing it with a memorandum from the desk. Dear me, murmured the commissary, with a crestfallen air, I really cannot imagine how I came to overlook this. Poirot louat led. The moral of that is, always look under the mats. My friend Hastings here will tell you that anything in the least crooked is a torment to me. As soon as I saw that the hearthrug was out of the straight, I said to myself, Tiens. The legs of the chair caught it in being pushed back. Possibly there may be something beneath it which the good Frangois overlooked. Frangois. Or Denise, or Leonie. Whoever did this room, since there is no dust, the room must have been done this morning. I reconstruct the incident like this. Yesterday, possibly last night, Monsieur Renaud drew a check to the order of someone named Divine. Afterwards it was torn up, and scattered on the floor. This morning but M. Bex was already pulling impatiently at the bell. Frangois answered it. Yes, there had been a lot of pieces of paper on the floor. What had she done with them? Put them in the kitchen stove, of course. M. had else? With a gesture of despair, Bex dismissed her. Then, his face lightening, he ran to the desk. In a minute he was hunting the dead man's checkbook. Then he repeated his former gesture. The last counterfoil was blank. Courage, cried Poirot, clapping him on the back. Without doubt, Madame Renaud will be able to tell us all about this mysterious person named Divine. The corn misery's face cleared. That is true. Let us proceed. As we turned to leave the room, Poirot remarked casually, it was here that Monsieur Renaud received his guest last night. It was, but how did you know? By this. I found it on the back of the leather chair. And he held up between his finger and thumb a long black hair, a woman's hair. M. Bex took us out by the back of the house to where there was a small shed leaning against the house. He produced a key from his pocket and unlocked it. The body is here. We moved it from the scene of the crime just before you arrived, as the photographers had done with it. He opened the door and we passed in. The murdered man lay on the ground, with a sheet over him. M. Bex dexterously whipped off the covering. Renaud was a man of medium height, slender, and lithe in figure. He looked about 50 years of age, and his dark hair was plentifully streaked with gray. He was clean-shaven with a long, thin nose, and eyes set rather close together, and his skin was deeply bronzed, as that of a man who had spent most of his life beneath tropical skies. His lips were drawn back from his teeth, and an expression of absolute amazement and terror was stamped on the livid features. One can see by his face that he was stabbed in the back, remarked Poirot. Very gently, he turned the dead man over. There, between the shoulder blades, staining the IW fawn overcoat, was a round dark patch. In the middle of it there was a slit in the cloth. Poirot examined it narrowly. Have you any idea with what weapon the crime was committed? It was left in the wound. The commissary reached down a large glass jar. In it was a small object that looked to me more like a paper knife than anything else. It had a black handle and a narrow shining blade. The whole thing was not more than 10 inches long. Poirot tested the discolored point gingerly with his fingertip. "Ma foi! But it is sharp. A nice easy little tool for murder." "Unfortunately, we could find no trace of fingerprints on it," remarked Bex regretfully. "The murderer must have worn gloves." "Of course he did," said Poirot contemptuously. "Even in Santiago they know enough for that. The veriest amateur of an English mise knows it thanks to the publicity the Bertillon system has been given in the press. All the same, it interests me very much that there were no fingerprints. It is so amazingly simple to leave the fingerprints of someone else. And then the police are happy." He shook his head. "I very much fear our criminal is not a man of method, either that or he was pressed for time. But we shall see." He let the body fall back into its original position. "He wore only underclothes under his overcoat, I see," he remarked. "Yes, the exam_LNG magistrate fluenx, that is rather a curious point." At this minute there was a tap on the door which Bex had closed after him. He strode forward and opened it. Frangoise was there. She endeavored to peep in with ghoulish curiosity. "Well, what is it?" demanded Bex impatiently. "Madam. She sends a message that she is much recovered and is quite ready to receive the exam magistrate." "Good," said Bex briskly. "Tell Monsieur Hotet and say that we will come at once." Poirot lingered a moment, looking back towards the body. I thought for a moment that he was going to apostrophize it, to declare aloud his determination never to rest till he had discovered the murderer. But when he spoke, it was tamely and awkwardly, and his cornement was ludicrously inappropriate to the solemnity of the moment. "He wore his overcoat very long," he said constrainedly. 5 Mrs. Renault's story. We found Hotet awaiting us in the hall, and we all proceeded upstairs together, Frangoise marching ahead to show us the way. Poirot went up in a zigzag fashion which puzzled me, until he whispered with a grimace, "No wonder the servants heard Renault mounting the stairs, not a board of them but creaks fit to awake the dead." At the head of the staircase, a small passage branched off. "The servants' quarters," explained Bex. We continued along a corridor, and Frangoise tapped on the last door to the right of it. A faint voice bade us enter, and we passed into a large, sunny apartment looking out towards the sea, which showed blue and sparkling about a quarter of a mile distant. On a couch, propped up with cushions, and attended by Dr. Durand, lay a tall, striking-looking woman. She was middle-aged, and her once dark hair was now almost entirely silvered, but the intense vitality and strength of her personality would have made itself felt anywhere. You knew at once that you were in the presence of what the French call un maîtresse femme. She greeted us with a dignified inclination of the head. "Pray be seated, messieurs." We took chairs, and the magistrate's clerk established himself at a round table. "I hope, madam," began Hotet, "that it will not distress you unduly to relate to us what occurred last night at Lt. "Not at all, monsieur. I know the value of time, if these scoundrelly assassins are to be caught at Lt and punished." "Very well, madam. It will fatigue you less, I think, if I ask you questions and you confine yourself to answering them. At what time did you go to bed last night?" "At 9:30, monsieur. I was tired." "And your husband?" "About an hour later, I fancy." "Did he seem disturbed, upset in any way?" "No, not more than usual." "What happened then?" "We slept. I was awakened by a hand pressed over my mouth. I tried to scream out, but the hand prevented me. There were 2 men in the room. They were both masked." "Can you describe them at all, madam?" "One was very tall, and had a long black beard, the other was short and stout. His beard was reddish. They both wore hats pulled down over their eyes." Said the magistrate. "Thou and Lly. Too much beard, I fear." "You mean they were false?" "Yes, madam. But continue your story." "It was the short man who was holding me. He forced a gag into my mouth, and then bound me with rope hand and foot. The other man was standing over my husband. He had caught up my little dagger paper knife from the dressing table and was holding it with the point just over his heart. When the short man had finished with me, he joined the other, and they forced my husband to get up and accompany them into the dressing room next door. I was nearly fainting with terror, nevertheless I listened desperately. They were speaking in too low a tone for me to hear what they said. But I recognized the language, a bastard Spanish such as is spoken in some parts of South America. They seemed to be demanding something from my husband, and presently they grew angry, and their voices rose a little. I think the tall man was speaking. "You know what we want," he said. "The secret. Is it?" I do not know what my husband answered, but the other replied fiercely, "You lie. We know you have it. Here are your keys." Then I heard sounds of drawers being pulled out. There is a safe on the wall of my husband's dressing room in which he always keeps a fairly large amount of ready money. Leonie tells me this has been rifled and the money taken, but evidently what they were looking for was not there, for presently I heard the tall man, with an oath, command my husband to dress himself. Soon after that, I think some noise in the house must have disturbed them, for they hustled my husband out into my room only half dressed. "Pardon," interrupted Poirot, "but is there then no other egress from the dressing room?" "No, monsieur, there is only the communicating door into my room." They hurried my husband, the short man in front, and the tall man behind him with the dagger still in his hand. Paul tried to break away to come to me. I saw his agonized eyes. He tuned to his captors. "I must speak to her," he said. Then, coming to the side of the bed, "It is all right, Héloïse," he said. "Do not be afraid. I shall return before morning." But, although he tried to make his voice confident, I could see the terror in his eyes. Then they hustled him out of the door, the tall man saying, "One sound and you are a dead man, remember." After that, continued Nears, "Renaud, I must have fainted. The next thing I recollect is Leonie rubbing my wrists and giving me brandy." "Madame Renaud," said the magistrate, "had you any idea what it was for which the assassins were searching?" "None whatever, monsieur." "Had you any knowledge that your husband feared something?" "Yes. I had seen the change in him." "How long ago was that?" "Nears." Renaud reflected. 10 days, perhaps. "Not longer." "Possibly. I only noticed it then." "Did you question your husband at all as to the cause?" "Once. He put me off evasively. Nevertheless, I was convinced that he was suffering some terrible amiety. However, since he evidently wished to conceal the fact from me, I tried to pretend that I had noticed nothing." "Were you aware that he had called in the services of a detective?" "A detective?" exclaimed Nears. Renaud, very much surprised. "Yes, this gentleman, Monsieur Hercule Poirot." Poirot bowed. "He arrived today in response to a summons from your husband." And taking the letter written by M. Renaud from his pocket, he handed it to the lady. She read it with apparently genuine astonishment. "I had no idea of this." Evidently he was highly cognizant of the danger. "Now, madam, I will beg of you to be frank with me. Is there any incident in your husband's past life in South America which might throw light on his murder?" Nears. Renaud reflected deeply, but at last shook her head. "I can think of none. Certainly my husband had many enemies, people he had got the better of in some way or another, but I can think of no one distinctive case. I do not say there is no such incident, only that I am not aware of it." The ex-arming magistrate stroked his beard disconsolately. "And you can fix the time of this outrage?" "Yes, I distinctly remember hearing the clock on the mantelpiece strike 2. She nodded towards an 8-day traveling clock in a leather case which stood in the center of the chimney-piece. Poirot rose from his seat, scrutinized the clock carefully, and nodded, satisfied. "And here too," exclaimed M. Bex, "is a wristwatch, knocked off the dressing table by the assassins, without doubt, and smashed to atoms. Little did they know it would testify against them." Gently he picked away the fragments of broken glass. Suddenly his face changed to one of utter stupefaction. "Mon Dieu!" he ejaculated. "What is it?" "The hands of the watch point to 7 o'clock. "What?" cried the exam_LNG magistrate, astonished. But Poirot, deft as ever, took the broken trinket from the startled commissary, and held it to his ear. Then he smiled. The glass is broken, yes, but the watch itself is still going. The explanation of the mystery was greeted with a relieved smile. But the magistrate bethought him of another point. But surely it is not 7 o'clock now. No, said Poirot gently, it is a few minutes after 5. Possibly the watch gains, is that so, madame? Nears. Renaud was frowning perplexedly. It does gain, she admitted. But I've never known it gain quite so much as that. With a gesture of impatience the magistrate left the matter of the watch and proceeded with his interrogatory. Madam, the front door was found ajar. It seems almost certain that the murderers entered that way, yet it has not been forced at all. Can you suggest any explanation? Possibly my husband went out for a stroll the last thing, and forgot to latch it when he came in. Is that a likely thing to happen? Very. My husband was the most absent-minded of men. There was a sl at lt frown on her brow as she spoke, as though this trait in the dead man's character had at times vexed her. There is one inference I think we might draw, remarked the commissary suddenly. Since the men insisted on Monsieur Renaud dressing himself, it looks as though the place they were taking him to, the place where the secret was concealed, lay some distance away. The magistrate nodded. Yes, far, and yet not too far, since he spoke of being back by morning. What time does the last train leave the station of Merlinville? Asked Poirot. 11:50, one way and 12:17 the other, but it is more probable that they had a motor waiting. Of course, agreed Poirot, looking somewhat crestfallen. Indeed, that might be one way of tracing through, continued the magistrate, brightening. A motor containing 2 foreigners is quite likely to have been noticed. That is an excellent point, Monsieur Bex. He smiled to himself, and then, becoming grave once more, he said to Mrs. Renaud, there is another question. Do you know anyone of the name of Diavine? Diavine? Mrs. Renaud repeated thoughtfully. No, for the moment, I cannot say I do. You have never heard your husband mention anyone of that name? Never. Do you know anyone whose Christian name is Bella? He watched Mrs. Renaud narrowly as he spoke, seeking to surprise any signs of anger or consciousness, but she merely shook her head in quite a natural manner. He continued his questions. Are you aware that your husband had a visitor last night? Now he saw the red mount slightly in her cheeks, but she replied convosely, no. Who was that? A lady. Indeed. But for the moment the magistrate was content to say no more. It seemed unlikely that Madame d'Aubruil had any connection with the crime, and he was anxious not to upset Mrs. Renaud more than necessary. He made a sign to the commissary, and the latter replied with a nod. Then rising, he went across the room, and returned with the glass jar we had seen in the outhouse in his hand. From this he took the dagger. And madame, he said gently, do you recognize Fluis? She gave a little cry. Yes, that is my little dagger. Then she saw the stained point, and she drew back, her eyes widening with horror. Is that blood? Yes, madame. Your husband was killed with this weapon. He removed it hastily from sight. You are quite sure about its being the one that was on your dressing table last? Oh, yes. It was a present from my son. He was in the Air Force during the war. He gave his age as older than it was. There was a touch of the proud mother in her voice. This was made from a streamline aeroplane wire, and was given to me by my son as a souvenir of the war. I see, madam. That brings us to another matter. Your son, where is he now? It is necessary that he should be telegraphed to without delay. Jack? He is on his way to Buenos Aires. Yes. My husband telegraphed to him yesterday. He had sent him on business to Paris, but yesterday he discovered that it would be necessary for him to proceed without delay to South America. There was a boat leaving Cherbourg for Buenos Aires last night, and he wired him to catch it. Have you any knowledge of what the business in Buenos Aires was? No, monsieur, I know nothing of its nature, but Buenos Aires is not my son's final destination. He was going overland from there to Santiago. And, In unison, the magistrate and the commissary exclaimed, "Santiago!" Again Santiago. It was at this moment, when we were all stunned by the mention of that word, that Poirot approached nears. Renaud. He had been standing by the window like a man lost in a dream, and I doubt if he had fully taken in what had passed. He paused by the lady's side with a bow. "Pardon, madam, but may I examine your wrists?" Thou at LSL at LTLY. Surprised at the request, Mrs. Renaud held them out to him. Round each of them was a cruel red mark where the cords had bitten into the flesh. As he examined them, I fancied that a momentary flicker of excitement I had seen in his eyes disappeared. "They must cause you great pain," he said, and once more he looked puzzled. But the magistrate was speaking excitedly. "Young Monsieur Renaud must be communicated with at once by wireless. It is vital that we should know anything he can tell us about this trip to Santiago." He hesitated. "I hoped he might have been near at hand, so that we could have saved you pain, madam." He paused. "You mean," she said in a low voice, "the identification of my husband's body?" The magistrate bowed his head. "I am a strong woman, monsieur. I can bear all that is required of me. I am ready. Oh, tomorrow will be quite soon enough, I assure you." "I prefer to get it over," she said in a low tone, a spasm of pain crossing her face. "If you will be so good as to give me your arm, doctor." The doctor hastened forward, a cloak was over Mrs. Renaud's shoulders, and a slow procession went down the stairs. Bex hurried on ahead to open the door of the shed. In a minute or two Nears Renaud appeared in the doorway. She was very pale, but resolute. She raised her hand to her MCE. "A moment, messieurs, while I steel myself." She took her hand away and looked down at the dead man. Then the marvelous self-control which had upheld her so far deserted her. "Paul," she cried. "Husband! Oh, God!" And pitching forward she fell unconscious to the ground. Instantly Poirot was beside her. He raised the lid of her eye, felt her pulse. When he had satisfied himself that she had really fainted, he drew aside. He caught me by the arm. "I am an imbecile, my friend. If ever there was love and grief in a woman's voice, I heard it then. My little idea was all tongue. Eh bien. I must start again." 6. The scene of the crime between them. The doctor and Mhotet carried the unconscious woman into the house. The commissary looked after them, shaking his head. "Pauvre femme," he murmured to himself. The shock was too much for her. Well, we can do nothing. Now, Monsieur Poirot, shall we visit the place where the crime was committed?" "If you please, Monsieur Bex." We passed the house, and out by the front door. Poirot had looked up at the staircase in passing, and shook his head in a dissatisfied manner. It is to me incredible that the servants heard nothing. The creaking of that staircase, with 3 people descending it, would awaken the dead. It was the middle of the night, remember. They were sound asleep by then, but Poirot continued to shake his head as though not fully accepting the explanation. On the sweep of the drive he paused, looking up at the house. What moved them in the first place to fry if the front door were open? It was a most unlikely thing that it should be. It was far more probable that they should at once fry to force a window. "But all the windows on the ground floor are barred with iron shutters," objected the commissary. Poirot pointed to a window on the first floor. "That is the window of the bedroom we have just come from, is it not? And see, there is a tree by which it would be the easiest thing in the world to mount." "Possibly," admitted the other. "But they could not have done so without leaving footprints in the flower bed." I saw the justice of his words. There were 2 large oval flower beds planted with scarlet geraniums, one each side of the steps leading up to the front door. The tree in question had its roots actually at the back of the bed itself, and it would have been impossible to reach it without stepping on the bed. "You see," continued the commissary, "owing to the dry weather no prints would show on the drive or paths, but, on the soft mold of the flower bed, it would have been a very different affair." Poirot went close to the bed and studied it attentively. As Bex had said, the mold was perfectly smooth. There was not an indentation on it anywhere. Poirot nodded, as Th01 at one convinced, and we turned away, but he suddenly darted off and began examining the other flower bed. "Monsieur Bex," he called. "See here. Here are plenty of traces for you." The commissary joined him and smiled. "My dear Monsieur Poirot, those are without doubt the footprints of the gardener's large hobnailed boots. In any case, it would have no importance, since this side we have no tree, and consequently no means of gaining access to the upper story." "True," said Poirot, evidently crestfallen. "So you think these footprints are of no importance?" "Not the least in the world." Then, to my utter astonishment, Poirot pronounced these words: "I do not agree with you. I have a little idea that these footprints are the most important things we have seen yet." Bex said nothing, merely shrugged his shoulders. He was far too courteous to utter his real opinion. "Shall we proceed?" he asked, instead. "Certainly. I can investigate this matter of the footprints later," said Poirot cheerily. Instead of following the drive down to the gate, Bex turned up a path that branched off at right angles. It led, up a slight incline, round to the right of the house, and was bordered on either side by a kind of shrubbery. Suddenly it emerged into a little clearing from which one obtained a view of the sea. A seat had been placed here, and not far from it was a rather ramshackle shed. A few steps farther on, a neat line of small bushes marked the boundary of the villa grounds. Bex pushed his way these, and we found ourselves on a wide stretch of open downs. I looked round, and saw something that filled me with astonishment. "Why, this is a golf course," I cried. Bex nodded. "The links are not completed yet," he explained. "It is hoped to be able to open them sometime next month. It was some of the men working on them who discovered the body early this morning." I gave a gasp. A little to my left, where for the moment I had overlooked it, was a long narrow pit, and by it, face downwards, was the body of a man. For a moment my heart gave a terrible leap, and I had a wild fancy that the tragedy had been duplicated. But the commissary dispelled my illusion by moving forward with a sharp exclamation of annoyance. "What have my police been about? They had strict orders to allow no one near the place without proper credentials." The man on the ground turned his head over his shoulder. "But I have proper credentials," he remarked, and rose slowly to his feet. "My dear Monsieur Giroux," cried the commissary, "I had no idea that you had arrived, even. The examined magistrate has been awaiting you with the utmost impatience." As he spoke, I was scanning the newcomer with the keenest curiosity. The famous detective from the Paris Surete was familiar to me by name, and I was extremely interested to see him in the flesh. He was very tall, perhaps about 30 years of age, with auburn hair and mustache, and a military carriage. There was a trace of arrogance in his manner which showed that he was fully alive to his own importance. Bex introduced us, presenting Poirot as a colleague. A flicker of interest came into the detective's eye. "I know you by name, Monsieur Poirot," he said. "You cut quite a figure in the old days, didn't you? But methods are very different now." "Crimes, though, are very much the same," remarked Poirot gently. I saw at once that Giroux was prepared to be hostile. He resented the other being associated with him, and I felt that if he came across any clue of importance he would be more than likely to keep it to himself. "The ex-arming magistrate," began Bex again. But Giroux interrupted rudely, "A fig for the exam_LNG magistrate. The light is the important thing. For all practical purposes it will be gone in another half-hour or so. I am all about the case, and the people at the house will do very well until tomorrow, but, if we're going to find a clue to the murderers, here is the spot we shall find it. Is it your police who have been trampling all over the place? I thought they knew better nowadays." "Assuredly they do. The marks you complain of were made by the workmen who discovered the body." The other grunted disgustedly. "I can see the tracks where the three of them came off the hedge, but they were cunning. You can just recognize the center foot marks as those of Monsieur Renaud, but those on either side have been carefully obliterated. Not that there would really be much to see anyway on this hard ground, but they weren't taking any chances." "The external sign," said Poirot. That is what you seek, eh? The other detective stared. Of course. A very faint smile came to Poirot's lips. He seemed about to speak, but checked himself. He bent down to where a spade was lying. That's what the grave was dug with, right in W, said Giroux. But you'll get nothing from it. It was Renaud's own spade, and the man who used it wore gloves. Here they are. He gesticulated with his foot to where two soil-stained gloves were lying. And they're Renaud's too, or at least his gardener's. I tell you, the men who carried out this crime were taking no chances. The man was stabbed with his own dagger, and would have been buried with his own spade. They counted on leaving no traces. But I'll beat them, there's always something. And I mean to find it. But Poirot was now apparently interested in something else, a short, discolored piece of lead piping which lay beside the spade. He touched it delicately with his finger. And does this, too, belong to the murdered man? He asked, and I thought I detected a subtle flavor of irony in the question. Giroux shrugged his shoulders to indicate that he neither knew nor cared. May have been lying around here for weeks. Anyway, it doesn't interest me. I, on the contrary, find it very interesting, said Poirot sweetly. I guessed that he was merely bent on annoying the Paris detective and, if so, he succeeded. The other turned away rudely, remarking that he had no time to waste, and bending down he resumed his minute search of the ground. Meanwhile, Poirot, as though struck by a sudden idea, stepped back over the boundary, and tried the door of the little shed. That's locked, said Giroux over his shoulder. But it's only a place where the gardener keeps his rubbish. The spade didn't come from there, but from the tool shed up by the house. And marvelous, murmured Bex ecstatically to me. He has been here but half an hour, and he already knows everything. What a man! Undoubtedly Giroux is the greatest detective alive today. Although I disliked the detective heartily, I nevertheless was secretly impressed. Efficiency seemed to radiate from the man. I could not help feeling that, so far, Poirot had not greatly distinguished himself, and it vexed me. He seemed to be directing his attention to all sorts of silly puerile points that had nothing to do with the case. Indeed, at this juncture, he suddenly asked, Monsieur Bex, tell me, I pray you, the meaning of this whitewashed line that extends all round the grave. Is it a device of the police? No, Monsieur Poirot, it is an affair of the golf course. It shows that there is here to be a bunker, as you call it. A bunker. Poirot turned to me. That is the irregular hole filled with sand in a bank at one side, is it not? I concurred. Monsieur Renaud, without doubt he played the golf. Yes, he was a keen golfer. It's mainly owing to him, and to his large subscriptions, that this work is being carried forward. He even had a say in the designing of it. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Then he remarked, it was not a very good choice they made of a spot to bury the body. When the men began to dig up the ground, all would have been discovered. Exactly, cried Giroux triumphantly. And that proves that they were strangers to the place. It's an excellent piece of indirect evidence. Yes, said Poirot doubtfully. No one who knew would bury a body there unless they wanted it to be discovered. And that is clearly _RD, is it not? Giroux did not even trouble to reply. Yes, said Poirot, in a somewhat dissatisfied voice. Yes, undoubtedly absurd. 7. The mysterious UXDAME d'Abreuil. As we retraced our steps to the house, Bex excused himself for leaving us, explaining that he must immediately acquaint the examining magistrate with the fact of Giroux's arrival. Giroux himself had been obviously delighted when Poirot declared that he had seen all he wanted. The last thing we observed, as we left the spot, was Giroux, crawling about on all fours, with a thoroughness in his search that I could not but admire. Poirot guessed my thou at LTS, for as soon as we were alone he remarked ironically, at last you have seen the detective you admire, the human foxhound. Is it not so, my friend? At any rate, he's doing something, I said, with asperity. If there's anything to find he'll find it. Now you __bien. I also have found something. A piece of lead piping. Nonsense, Poirot. You know very well that's got nothing to do with it. I meant little things, traces that may lead us infallibly to the murderers. Mon ami, a clue of 2 feet long is every bit as valuable as one measuring 2 millimeters. But it is the romantic idea that all important clues must be infinitesimal. As to the piece of lead piping having nothing to do with the crime, you say that because Giroux told you so. No, as I was about to interpose a question, we will say no more. Leave Giroux to his search, and me to my ideas. The case seems straightforward enough, and yet, mon ami, I am not satisfied. And do you know why? Because of the wristwatch that is 2 hours fast. And then there are several curious little points that do not seem to fit in. For instance, if the object of the murderers was revenge, why did they not stab Renaud in his sleep and have done with it? They wanted the secret, I reminded him. Poirot brushed a speck of dust from his sleeve with a dissatisfied air. Well, where is this secret? Presumably some distance away, since they wish him to dress himself. Yet he is found murdered close at hand, almost within earshot of the house. Then again, it is pure chance that a weapon such as the dagger should be lying about casually, ready to hand. He paused, frowning, and then went on, why did the servants hear nothing? Were they drugged? Was there an accomplice, and did that accomplice see to it that the front door should remain open? I wonder if he stopped abruptly. We had reached the drive in front of the house. Suddenly he turned to me. My friend, I am about to surprise you to please you. I have taken your reproaches to heart. We will examine some footprints. Where? In that right-hand bed yonder. Monsieur Bex says that they are the footmarks of the gardener. Let us see if this is so. See, he approaches with his wheelbarrow. Indeed, an elderly man was just crossing the drive with a barrow full of seedlings. Poirot called to him, and he set down the barrow and came hobbling towards us. You are going to ask him for one of his boots to compare with the footmarks? I asked breathlessly. My faith in Poirot revived a little. Since he said the footprints in this right-hand bed were important, presumably they were. Exactly, said Poirot. But won't he think it very odd? He will not think about it at all. We could say no more, for the old man had joined us. You want me for something, monsieur? Yes. You have been gardener here a long time, haven't you? 24 years, monsieur. And your name is? Augusta, monsieur. I was admiring these magnificent geraniums. They are truly superb. They have been planted long. Some time, monsieur. But of course, to keep the beds looking smart, one must keep bedding out a few new plants, and remove those that are over, besides keeping the old blooms well picked off. You put in some new plants yesterday, didn't you? Those in the middle there, and in the other bed also. Monsieur has a sharp eye. It takes always a day or so for them to pick up. Yes, I put 10 new plants in each bed last night. As monsieur doubtless knows, one should not put in plants when the sun is hot. Augusta was charmed with Poirot's interest, and was quite inclined to be garrulous. That is a splendid specimen there, said Poirot, pointing. Might I perhaps have a cutting of it? But certainly, monsieur. The old fellow stepped into the bed, and carelessly took a slip from the plant Poirot had admired. Poirot was profuse in his thanks, and Augusta departed to his barrow. You see, said Poirot with a smile, as he bent over the bed to examine the indentation off the gardener's hobnailed boot. It is quite simple. I did not realize that the foot would be inside the boot. You do not use your excellent mental capacities sumsciently. Well, what of the footmark? I examined the bed carefully. All the footmarks in the bed were made by the same boot, I said at length after a careful study. You think so? Eh bien. I agree with you, said Poirot. He seemed quite uninterested, and as though he were thinking of something else. At any rate, I remarked, you will have one bee less in your bonnet now. Mon Dieu! But what an idiom! What does it mean? What I meant was that now you will give up your interest in these footmarks. But to my surprise Poirot shook his head. No, no, mon ami. At last am on the right track. I am still in the dark, but, as I hinted just now to Monsieur Bex, these footmarks are the most important and interesting things in the case. That poor Giroux, I should not be surprised if he took no notice of them whatever. At that moment the front door opened, and Mhotet and the commissary came down the steps. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot, we were coming to look for you," said the magistrate. "It is getting late, but I wish to pay a visit to Madame d'Aubruil. Without doubt she will be very much upset by Monsieur Renaud's death, and we may be fortunate enough to get a clue from her. The secret that he did not confide to his wife, it is possible that he may have told it to the woman whose love held him enslaved. We know where our Samsons are weak, don't we?" said no more, but fell into line. Poirot walked with the examining magistrate, and the commissary and I followed a few paces behind. "There is no doubt that Frangois's story is substantially correct," he remarked to me in a confidential tone. "I have been telephoning headquarters. It seems that 3 times in the last 6 weeks, that is to say since the arrival of Monsieur Renaud at Merlinville, Madame d'Aubruil has paid a large sum in notes into her banking account. Altogether the sum totals 200,000 francs. Dear me, I said, considering, that must be something like 4,000 pounds. Precisely. Yes, there can be no doubt that he was absolutely infatuated. But it remains to be seen whether he confided his secret to her. The examining magistrate is hopeful, but I hardly share his views." During this conversation we were walking down the lane towards the fork in the road where our car had halted earlier in the afternoon, and in another moment I realized that the Villa Marguerite, the home of the mysterious Madame d'Aubruil, was the small house from which the beautiful girl had emerged. "She has lived here for many years," said the commissary, nodding his head towards the house. "Very quietly, very unobtrusively. She seems to have no friends or relations other than the acquaintances she has made in Merlinville. She never refers to the past, nor to her husband. One does not even know if he is alive or dead. There is a mystery about her, you comprehend." I nodded, my interest growing. "And the dau and?" I ventured. "A truly beautiful young girl, modest, devout, all that she should be. One pities her, for, though she may know nothing of the past, a man who wants to ask her hand in marriage must necessarily inform himself," and then the commissary shrugged his shoulders cynically. "But it would not be her fault," I cried, with rising indignation. "No. But what will you? A man is particular about his wife's antecedents." I was prevented from further argument by our arrival at the door. Mhotet rang the bell. A few minutes elapsed, and then we heard a footfall within, and the door was opened. On the stood my young goddess of that afternoon. When she saw us, the color left her cheeks, leaving her deathly white, and her eyes widened with apprehension. There was no doubt about it, she was afraid. "Mademoiselle d'Aubruil," said Mhotet, sweeping off his hat, "we regret infinitely to disturb you, but the exigencies of the law, you comprehend? My conv lements to Madame your mother, and will she have the goodness to grant me a few moments' interview?" For a moment the girl stood motionless. Her left hand was pressed to her side, as though at to still the sudden unconquerable agitation of her heart. But she mastered herself, and said in a low voice, "I will go and see. Please come inside." She entered a room on the left of the hall, and we heard the low murmur of her voice. And then another voice, much the same in timbre, but with a slightly harder inflection behind its mellow roundness, said, "But certainly. Ask them to enter." In another minute we were face to face with the mysterious Madame d'Aubruil. She was not nearly so tall as her daughter, and the rounded curves of her figure had all the grace of full maturity. Her hair, again unlike her daughter's, was dark, and parted in the middle in the Madonna style. Her eyes, half hidden by the drooping lids, were blue. Though very well preserved, she was certainly no longer young, but her charm was of the quality which is independent of age. "You wished to see me, monsieur?" she asked. "Yes, madame." Mhotet cleared his throat. "I am investigating the death of Monsieur Renaud. You have heard of it, no doubt." She bowed her head without speaking. Her expression did not change. We came to ask you whether you can throw any light upon the circumstances surrounding it. The surprise of her tone was excellent. Yes, madam. We have reason to believe that you were in the habit of visiting the dead man at his villa in the evenings. Is that so? The color rose in the lady's pale cheeks, but she replied quietly, I deny your right to ask me such a question. Madam, we are investigating a murder. Well, what of it? I had nothing to do with the murder. Madam, we do not say that for a moment. But you knew the dead man well. Did he ever confide in you as to any danger that him? Never. Did he ever mention his life in Santiago, and any enemies he may have made there? No. Then you can give us no help at all. I fear not. I really do not see why you should come to me. Cannot his wife tell you what you want to know? Her voice held a slender inflection of irony. Mrs. Renaud has told us all she can. Ah, said Madame d'Aubruil. I wonder you wonder what, madam? Nothing. The ex-arming magistrate looked at her. He was aware that he was fighting a duel, and that he had no mean antagonist. You persist in your statement that Monsieur Renaud confided nothing to you. Why should you think it likely that he should confide in me? Because, madam, said Imhotep, with calculated brutality, a man tells to his mistress what he does not always tell to his wife. Ah! She sprang forward. Her eyes flashed fire. Monsieur, you insult me. And before my daughter. I can tell you nothing. Have the goodness to leave my house. The honors undoubtedly rested with the lady. We left the Villa Marguerite like a shamefaced pack of schoolboys. The magistrate muttered angry ejaculations to himself. Poirot seemed lost in thought. Suddenly he came out of his reverie with a start, and inquired of Imhotep if there was a good hotel near at hand. There is a small place, the Hotel de Bains, on Fluis side of the town a few hundred yards down the road. It will be handy for your investigations. We shall see you in the morning, then, I presume. Yes, I thank you, Monsieur Hotep. With mutual civilities we parted company, Poirot and I going towards Merlinville, and the others returning to the Villa Genevieve. The French police system is very marvelous, said Poirot, looking after them. The information they possess about everyone's life, down to the most commonplace detail, is extraordinary. Though he has only been here a little over 6 weeks, they are perfectly well acquainted with Monsieur Renaud's tastes and pursuits, and at a moment's notice they can produce information as to Madame d'Aubruil's banking account, and the sums that have lately been paid in. Undoubtedly the dossier is a great institution, but what is that? He turned sharply. A figure was running hatless down the road after us. It was Martha d'Aubruil. I beg your pardon, she cried breathlessly, as she reached us. I should not do this, I know. You must not tell my mother. But is it true, what the people say, that Monsieur Renaud called in a detective before he died, and that you are he? Yes, mademoiselle, said Poirot gently. It is quite true. But how did you learn it? Frangois told our Amélie, evlained Martha with a blush. Poirot made a grimace. The secrecy, it is impossible in an affair of this kind. Not that it matters. Well, mademoiselle, what is it you want to know? The girl hesitated. She seemed longing, yet fearing, to speak at last. Almost in a whisper, she asked, is anyone suspected? Poirot eyed her keenly. Then he replied evasively, suspicion is in the air at present, mademoiselle. Yes, I know, but anyone in particular? Why do you want to know? The girl seemed frightened by the question. All at once Poirot's words about her earlier in the day occurred to me. The girl with the amious eyes. Monsieur Renaud was always very kind to me, she replied at last. It is natural that I should be interested. I see, said Poirot. Well, mademoiselle, suspicion at present is hovering round 2 persons. 2. I could have sworn there was a note of surprise and relief in her voice. Their names are unknown, but they are presumed to be Chileans from Santiago. And now, mademoiselle, you see what comes of being young and beautiful. I have betrayed professional secrets for you." The girl led merrily, and then, rather shyly, she thanked him. "I must run back now. Ma Man will miss me." And she turned and ran back up the road, looking like a modern Atlanta. "I stared after Mon Ami," said Poirot, in his gentle ironical voice. "Is it that we are to remain planted here all night just because you have seen a beautiful young woman, and your head is in a whirl?" I laughed and apologized. "But she is beautiful, Poirot. Anyone might be excused for being bowled over by her." But to my surprise Poirot shook his head very earnestly. "Ah, mon ami, do not set your heart on Martha d'Aubruil. She is not for you, that one. Take it from Papa Poirot." "Why," I cried, "the commissary assured me that she was as good as she is beautiful. A perfect angel." "Some of the greatest criminals I have known had the faces of angels," remarked Poirot cheerfully. "A malformation of the grey cells may coincide quite easily with the face of a Madonna." "Poirot," I cried, horrified, "you cannot mean that you suspect an innocent child like this." "Ta ta ta. Do not excite yourself. Lo, I have not said that I suspected her. But you must admit that her anxiety to know about the case is somewhat unusual." "For once I see farther than you do," I said. "Her anxiety is not for herself but for her mother." "My friend," said Poirot, "as usual, you see nothing at all. Madame d'Aubruil is very well able to look after herself without her daughter worrying about her. I admit I was teasing you just now, but all the same I repeat what I said before. Do not set your heart on that girl. She is not for you. I, Hercule Poirot, know it. Sacre! If only I could remember where I had seen that face." "What face?" I asked, surprised. "The daughter's." "No. The mother's." Noting my surprise, he nodded emphatically. "But yes, it is as I tell you. It was a long time ago, when I was still with the police in Belgium. I have never actually seen the woman before, but I have seen her picture and in connection with some case. I rather fancy, yes, I may be mistaken, but I rather fancy that it was a murder case." On meeting we were up at the Villa betimes next morning. The man on guard at the gate did not bar our way this time. Instead, he respectfully saluted us, and we passed on to the house. The maid Leonie was just coming down the stairs, and seemed not averse to the prospect of a little conversation. Poirot inquired after the health of Mrs. Renaud. Leonie shook her head. "She is terribly upset, the poor lady. She will eat nothing but nothing. And she is as pale as a ghost. It is here trending to see her. Ah, it is not I who would grieve like that for a man who had deceived me with another woman." Poirot nodded sympathetically. "What you say is very just, but what will you? The heart of a woman who loves will forgive many blows. Still undoubtedly there must have been many scenes of recrimination between them in the last few months." Again Leonie shook her head. "Never, monsieur. Never have I heard Madame utter a word of protest of reproach, even. She had the temper and disposition of an angel quite different to monsieur. Monsieur Renaud had not the temper of an angel too, far from it. He enraged himself, the whole house knew of it. The day that he quarreled with Monsieur Jacques Mafoy. They might have been heard in the marketplace, they shouted so loud." "Indeed," said Poirot. "And when did this quarrel take place?" "Oh, it was just before Monsieur Jacques went to Paris. Almost he missed his train. He came out of the library, and caught up his bag which he had left in the hall. The automobile, it was being repaired, and he had to run for the station. I was dusting the salon, and I saw him pass, and his face was white with 2 burning spots of red. Ah, but Leonie was enjoying her narrative thoroughly. "And the dispute, what was it about?" "Ah, that I do not know," confessed Leonie. "It is true that they shouted, but their voices were so loud and high, and they spoke so fast, that only one well acquainted with English could have comprehended. But monsieur, he was like a thundercloud all day. Impossible to please him." The sound of a door shutting upstairs cut short Leonie's loquacity. "And Frangois who awaits me," she exclaimed, awakening to a tardy remembrance of her duties. That old one, she always scolds. One moment, mademoiselle. The examining magistrate, where is he? They have gone out to look at the automobile in the garage. Monsieur the commissary had some idea that it might have been used on the night of the murder. Quelle idée, murmured Poirot, as the girl disappeared. You will go out and join them. No, I shall await their return in the salon. It is cool there on this hot morning. This placid way of taking things did not quite commend itself to me. If you don't mind, I said, and hesitated. Not in the least. You wish to investigate on your own account, eh? Well, I'd rather like to have a look at Giroux, if he's anywhere about, and see what he's up to. The human foxhound, murmured Poirot, as he leaned back in a comfortable chair, and closed his eyes. By all means, my friend. Au revoir. I strolled out of the front door. It was certainly hot. I turned up the path we had taken the day before. I had a mind to study the scene of the crime myself. I did not go directly to the spot, however, but turned aside into the bushes, so as to come out on the links some 100 yards or so farther to the right. The shrubbery here was much denser, and I had quite a struggle to force my way when I emerged at last on the course. It was quite unexpectedly and with such vigor that I cannoned heavily into a young lady who had been standing with her back to the plantation. She not unnaturally gave a suppressed shriek, but I, too, uttered an exclamation of surprise. For it was my friend of the train, Cinderella. The surprise was mutual. We both exclaimed simultaneously. The young lady recovered herself first. My only aunt, she exclaimed. What are you doing here? For the matter of that, what are you? I retorted. When last I saw you, the day before yesterday, you were trotting home to England like a good little boy. When last I saw you, I said, you were trotting home with your sister, like a good little girl. By the way, how is your sister? A flash of white teeth rewarded me. How HND of you to ask. My sister is well, I thank you. She is here with you. She remained in town, said the mim with dignity. I don't believe you've got a sister, I laughed. If you have, her name is Harris. Do you remember mine? She asked with a smile. Cinderella. But you're going to tell me the real one now, aren't you? She shook her head with a wicked look. Not even why you're here. Oh, that. I suppose you've heard of members of my profession resting at expensive French watering places. Dirt cheap if you know where to go. I eyed her keenly. Still, you'd no intention of coming here when I met you 2 days ago. We all have our disappointments, said Miss Cinderella sententiously. There now, I've told you quite as much as is good for you. Little boys should not be inquisitive. You've not yet told me what you're doing here. You remember my telling you that my great friend was a detective? Yes, and perhaps you've heard about this crime at the Villa Genevieve. She stared at me. Her breast heaved, and her eyes grew wide and round. You don't mean that you're in on that? I nodded. There was no doubt that I had scored heavily. Her emotion, as she regarded me, was only too evident. For some few seconds she remained silent, staring at me. Then she nodded her head emphatically. Well, if that doesn't beat the band. Tote me round. I want to see all the horrors. What do you mean? What'd I say? Bless the boy, didn't I tell you I doted on crimes? I've been nosing round for hours. It's a real piece of luck happening on you this way. Come on, show me all the S at LTS. But look here, wait a minute, I can't. Nobody S allowed in there, a wall strict. Aren't you and your friends the big bugs? I was loath to relinquish my position of importance. Why are you so keen? I asked weakly. And what is it you want to see? Oh, everything. The place where it happened, and the weapon, and the body, and any fingerprints or interesting things like that. I've never had a chance before of being right in on a murder like this. It'll last me all my life. I turned away, sickened. What were women coming to nowadays? The girl's ghoulish excitement nauseated me. Come off her horse, said the lady suddenly. And don't give yourself airs. When you got called to this job, did you put your nose in the air and say it was a nasty business, and you wouldn't be mixed up in it? No, but if I'd been here on a holiday, wouldn't you be nosing round just the same as I am? Of course you would. I'm a man. You're a woman. Your idea of a woman is someone who gets on a chair and shrieks if she sees a mouse. That's all prehistoric. But you will show me round, won't you? You see, it might make a big difference to me. In what way? They're keeping all the reporters out. I might make a big scoop with one of the papers. You don't know how much they pay for a bit of inside stuff. I hesitated. She slipped a small soft hand into mine. Please there, essay dear. I capitulated. Secretly, I knew that I should rather oi the part of showman. We repaired first to the spot where the body had been discovered. A man was on guard there, who saluted respectfully, emowing me by sight, and raised no questions as to my companion. Presumably he regarded her as vouched for by me. I explained to Cinderella just how the discovery had been made, and she listened attentively, sometimes putting an intelligent question. Then we turned our steps in the direction of the villa. I proceeded rather cautiously, for, truth to tell, I was not at all amused to meet anyone. I took the girl the shrubbery round to the back of the house where the small shed was. I recollected that yesterday evening, after relocking the door, Bex had left the key with the Sergeant de Ville, and Larcod, in case Monsieur Giroux should require it while we are upstairs. I thought it quite likely that the Surete detective, after using it, had returned it to Marchaud again. Leaving the girl out of sight in the shrubbery, I entered the house. Marchaud was on duty outside the door of the salon. From within came the murmur of voices. Monsieur desires Monsieur Hotet? He is within. He is again interrogating Frangoise. No, I said hastily, I don't want him, but I should very much like the key of the shed outside if it is not against regulations. But certainly, monsieur. He produced it. Here it is. Monsieur Hotet gave orders that all facilities were to be placed at your disposal. You will return it to me when you have finished out there, that is all. Of course. I felt a of satisfaction as I realized that in Marchaud's eyes, at least, I ranked equally in importance with Poirot. The girl was waiting for me. She gave an exclamation of delight as she saw the key in my hand. You've got it then. Of course, I said coolly. All the same, you know, what I'm doing is highly irregular. You've been a perfect duck, and I shan't forget it. Come along. They can't see us from the house, can they? Wait a minute. I'm rested her eager advance. I won't stop you if I really wish to go in. But do you? You've seen the grave, and the grounds, and you've heard all the details of the affair. Isn't that enough for you? This is going to be gruesome, you know, and unpleasant. She looked at me for a moment with an expression that I could not quite fathom, then she led me for the horrors, she said. Come along. In silence we arrived at the door of the shed. I opened it and we passed. I walked over to the body, and gently pulled down the sheet as Bex had done the preceding afternoon. A little gasping sound escaped from the girl's lips, and I turned and looked at her. There was horror on her face now, and those debonair high spirits of hers were quenched utterly. She had not chosen to listen to my advice, and she was punished now for her disregard of it. I felt singularly merciless towards her. She should go with it now. I tuned the corpse over gently. You see, I said. He was stabbed in the back. Her voice was almost soundless. With what? I nodded towards the glass jar. That danger. Suddenly the girl reeled, and then sank down in a heap. I sprang to her assistance. You are faint. Come out of here. It has been too much for you. Water, she murmured. Quick. Water. I left her, and rushed into the house. Fortunately none of the servants were about, and I was able to secure a glass of water unobserved and add a few drops of brandy from a pocket flask. In a few minutes I was back again. The girl was lying as I had left her, but a few sips of the brandy and water revived her in a marvelous manner. Take me out of here, oh, quickly, quickly, she cried, shuddering. Supporting her with my arm, I led her out into the air, and she pulled the door to behind her. Then she drew a deep breath. "That's better." "Oh, it was horrible. Why did you ever let me go in?" I felt this to be so feminine that I could not forbear a smile. Secretly, I was not dissatisfied with her collapse. It proved that she was not quite so callous as I had thought her. After all, she was little more than a child, and her curiosity had probably been of the unthinking order. "I did my best to stop you, you know," I said gently. "I suppose you did. Well, goodbye. Look here, you can't start off like that all alone. You're not fit for it. I insist on accompanying you back to Merlinville." "Nonsense. I'm quite all right at LT now. Supposing you felt faint again?" "No, I shall come with you," but this she combated with a good deal in the end. However, I prevailed so far as to be allowed to accompany her to the outskirts of the town. We retraced our steps over our former route, passing the grave again, and making a detour onto the road. Where the first straggling line of shops began, she stopped, and held out her hand. "Goodbye, and thank you ever so much for coming with me. Are you sure you're all right at LT now?" "Quite, thanks. I hope you don't get into any trouble over showing me things." I disclaimed the idea at LTLY. "Well, goodbye." "Au revoir," I corrected. "If you're staying here, we shall meet again." She flashed a smile at me. "That's so. Au revoir, then. Wait a second, you haven't told me your address." "Oh, I'm staying at the Hotel du Fer. It's a little place, but quite good. Come and look me up tomorrow." "I will," I said, with perhaps rather unnecessary empressement. I watched her out of sight, then turned and retraced my steps to the villa. I remembered that I had not relocked the door of the shed. Fortunately no one had noticed the oversight, and turning the key I removed it and returned it to the Sergeant de Ville. And, as I did so, it came upon me suddenly that though Cinderella had given me her address, I still did not know her name. 9 Ma Giroux finds some clues in the salon. I found the exam_LNG magistrate busily interrogating the old gardener, Augusta. Poirot and the commissary, who were both present, greeted me respectively with a smile and a polite bow. I slipped quietly into a seat. Imhotep was painstaking and meticulous in the extreme, but did not succeed in eliciting anything of importance. The gardening gloves Augusta admitted to be his. He wore them when handling a certain species of primula plant which was poisonous to some people. He could not say when he had worn them last. Certainly he had not missed them. Where were they kept? Sometimes in one place, sometimes in another. The spade was usually to be found in the small tool shed. Was it locked? Of course it was locked. Where was the key kept? Parbleu, it was in the door, of course. There was nothing of value to steal. Who would have expected a party of bandits, or assassins? Such things did not happen in Madame la Vicomtesse Imhotep. Signifying that he had finished with him, the old man withdrew, grumbling to the last. Remembering Poirot's unaccountable insistence on the footprints in the flower beds, I scrutinized him narrowly as he gave his evidence. Either he had nothing to do with the crime or he was a consummate actor. Suddenly, just as he was going out of the door, an idea struck me. "Pardon, Monsieur Hotep," I cried, "but will you permit me to ask him one question?" "But certainly, monsieur." Thus encouraged, I turned to Augusta. "Where do you keep your boots?" "On my feet," growled the old man. Here else." "But when you go to bed at LT?" "Under my bed." "But who cleans them?" "Nobody." "Why should they be cleaned? Is it that I promenade myself on the front like a young man? On Sunday I wear the Sunday boots, but otherwise." He shrugged his shoulders. I shook my head, discouraged. Well, said the magistrate, "we do not advance very much. Undoubtedly we are held up until we get the return cable from Santiago. Has anyone seen Giroux? In verity that one lacks politeness. I have a very good mind to send for him, and you will not have to send far." The quiet voice startled us. Giroux was standing outside looking in tea from the open window. He leapt lightly into the room and advanced to the table. "Here I am, at your service. Accept my excuses for not presenting myself sooner." "Not at all, not at all," said the magistrate, rather confused. "Of course I am only a detective," continued the other. "I know nothing of interrogatories. Were I conducting one, I should be inclined to do so without an open window. Anyone standing outside can so easily hear all that passes. But no matter." Imhotep flushed angrily. There was evidently going to be no love lost between the examining magistrate and the detective in charge of the case. They had fallen foul of each other at the start. Perhaps in any event it would have been much the same. To Giroux, all ex-arming magistrates were fools, and to Imhotep, who took himself seriously, the casual manner of the Paris detective could not fail to give offense. "Eh bien, Monsieur Giroux," said the magistrate rather sharply. "Without doubt you have been employing your time to a marvel. You have the names of the assassins for us, have you not? And also the precise spot where they find themselves now." Unmoved by this irony, M. Giroux replied, "I know at least where they have come from." Giroux took two small objects from his pocket and laid them down on the table. We crowded round. The objects were very simple ones, the stub of a cigarette and an unlighted match. The detective wheeled round on Poirot. "What do you see there?" he asked. There was something almost brutal in his tone. It made my cheeks flush, but Poirot remained unmoved. He shrugged his shoulders. "A cigarette end in a match. And what does that tell you?" Poirot spread out his hands. "It tells me nothing." "Ah," said Giroux, in a satisfied voice. "You haven't made a study of these things. That's not an ordinary match, not in this country at least. It's common enough in South America. Luckily it's unlighted. I mightn't have recognized it otherwise." Evidently one of the men threw away his cigarette and lit another, spilling one match out of the box as he did. "And the other match?" asked Poirot. "Which match?" "The one he did light his cigarette with." "You have found that also?" "No. Perhaps you didn't search very thoroughly." "Not search thoroughly." For a moment it seemed as though the detective was going to break out angrily, but with an effort he controlled himself. "I see you love a joke, Monsieur Poirot. But in any case, match or no match, the cigarette end would be sufficient. It is a South American cigarette with licorice pectoral paper." Poirot bowed. The commissary spoke. "The cigarette end and match might have belonged to Monsieur Renaud. Remember, it is only 2 years since he returned from South America." "No," replied the other confidently. "I have already searched among the effects of Monsieur Renaud. The cigarettes he smoked and the matches he used are quite different." "You do not think it odd," asked Poirot, "that these strangers should come unprovided with a weapon, with gloves, with a spade, and that they should so conveniently find all these things?" Giroux smiled in a rather superior manner. "Undoubtedly it is strange. Indeed, without the theory that I hold, it would be inexplicable." "Aha," said Imhotep. "An accomplice within the house." "Or outside it," said Giroux, with a peculiar smile. "But someone must have admitted them. We cannot allow that, by an unparalleled piece of good fortune, they found the door ajar for them to walk in. The door was opened for them, but it could just as easily be opened from outside by someone who possessed a key." "But who did possess a key?" Giroux shrugged his shoulders. "As for that, no one who possesses one is going to admit the fact if he can help it. But several people might have had one. Monsieur Jacques Renaud, the son, for instance. It is true that he is on his way to South America, but he might have lost the key or had it stolen from him. Then there is the gardener. He has been here many years. One of the younger servants may have a lover. It is easy to take an impression of a key and have one cut. There are many possibilities. Then there is another person who, I should judge, is exceedingly likely to have such a thing." "Who is that?" "Madame d'Aubruil," said the detective. Said the magistrate. "So you have heard about that, have you?" "I hear everything," said Giroux imperturbably. "There is one thing I could swear you have not heard," said Imhotep, delighted to be able to show superior knowledge, and without more ado he retailed the story of the mysterious visitor the night before. He also touched on the check made out to Devine, and finally handed Giroux the letter signed Bella. All very interesting. But my theory remains unaffected. And your theory is? For the moment I prefer not to say. Remember, I am only just beginning my investigations. Tell me one thing, Monsieur Giroux, said Poirot suddenly. Your theory allows for the door being opened. It does not explain why it was left open when they departed. Would it not have been natural for them to close it behind them? If a Sergeant Deville had chanced to come up to the house, as is sometimes done to see that all is well, they might have been discovered and overtaken almost at once. Bah! They forgot it. A mistake, I grant you. Then, to my surprise, Poirot uttered almost the same words as he had uttered to Bex the previous evening. I do not agree with you. The door being left open was the result of either design or necessity, and any theory that does not admit that fact is bound to prove vain. We all regarded the little man with a good deal of astonishment. The confession of ignorance drawn from him over the match end had, I thought, been bound to humiliate Hera, but here he was self-satisfied as ever, laying down the law to Giroux without a tremor. The detective twisted his mustache, eyeing my friend in a somewhat bantering fashion. You don't agree with me, eh? Well, what strikes you particularly about the case? Let's hear your views. One thing presents itself to me as being significant. Tell me, Monsieur Giroux, does nothing strike you as familiar about this case? Is there nothing it reminds you of? Familiar? Reminds me of? I can't say, M.A.N.D. I don't think so, though you are wrong, said Poirot quietly. A crime almost precisely similar has been committed before. When? And where? Ah, that, unfortunately, I cannot for the moment remember, but I shall do so. I had hoped you might be able to assist me. Giroux snorted incredulously. There have been many affairs of masked men. I cannot remember the details of them all. The crimes all resemble each other more or less. There is such a thing as the individual touch. Poirot suddenly assumed his lecturing manner, and addressed us collectively. I am speaking to you now of the psychology of crime. Monsieur Giroux knows quite well that each criminal has his particular method, and that the police, when called in to investigate, say, a case of burglary, can often make a shrewd guess at the offender, simply by the peculiar methods he has employed. Jap would